Harry Potter is one of my favorite series of movies or books, and it was a big part of my inspiration to get into role playing games. I mean, what kid didn't want to get a letter in the mail summoning them to Hogwarts? Or have Hagrid show up at your door and tell you, "You're a wizard"? Well, I never got my letter. Maybe you did. Either way, let's talk about what we, as storytellers, can learn from Harry Potter. So blow the foam off your butterbeer and grab a quill. Let's get started. Welcome to the Upstairs Table. Today we are talking about Harry Potter and three things that I noticed while reading through the books for the ninth time. Before we go any further, I apologize for the ruined sound. My landscaping crew decided to show up today, but I still wanted to get this video made. So what did I learn? I noticed how few locations the characters actually go to, unique redemption arcs for three different villain characters, and a totally different take on how the villain interacts with the heroes. While Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, and the Game of Thrones series all involve vast worlds with characters traveling hundreds of miles between locations, the Harry Potter series takes a different approach. For 6 out of 7 books, we barely leave the confines of a secondary school in Scotland. Instead of the child adventurers being sent on a quest to conquer evil in a faraway land, evil keeps coming back and knocking on their door. With a story like that, suddenly our job of world building gets a lot easier and a whole lot simpler. So how do we as DMs do it? How do we tell a compelling story with so few locations? Let's start by classifying the types of locations we can create and use in our stories and how much attention each classification should get in preparation. So first, let's talk about primary locations. These are the most important, influential locations in our story. In Harry Potter, these kinds of locations are going to be Hogwarts, of course, the Ministry of Magic, and I would say the wilderness, where Harry spends some time hunting for Horcruxes in the 7th book. These locations are fundamental, not only to the character arcs, but to the major plot points throughout the story. When big stuff goes down, it's almost always going to be in one of these locations. Primary locations are where we need to spend most of our time in preparation, building out detailed rooms, lots and lots of NPCs to talk to, and paying attention to when, where, and how the villain is going to be interacting with the players, whether it's combat or otherwise. Then we have secondary locations. These are places that still have influence in our story, but won't be constantly recurring or common locations with a lot of quest lines flowing through them. Maybe they're part of a character's backstory, or it's a place they need to go as part of a particular quest, but they're not going to serve as these battlegrounds or these very influential locations anytime soon. Unless murder hobos decide to burn it all to the ground. Maybe it's just a shopping location. That I would consider a secondary location as well. For Harry Potter, I think of places like Diagon Alley, of course, number 4, Privet Drive. I mean, that's where so much of Harry's character arc grows out of. But Voldemort doesn't exactly show up all the time. Or number 12, Grimmauld Place, where the Order of Phoenix establishes a new resistance, and Harry hopes to be able to move in and find a new home with his godfather. But even that plan never actually happens, and it's not, otherwise it would be a primary location. Secondary locations take a lot less prep than primary locations, but you probably need to make sure you have at least 1 or 2 NPCs to talk to or participate in the story. Lastly, tertiary locations. As you can guess, they're less important and, as a result, take even less work than primary or secondary locations. Our examples from Harry Potter are going to be King's Cross Station, Gringotts Bank, and Nocturne Alley, I think, is a good example. These are locations that you improvise, and you probably are just going to make them up as you go when players make a choice you don't expect. I picture a GM describing the character's first use of flue powder, and it just goes horribly wrong. Maybe, the GM decides it's the first time the character's used flue powder, so you got to step into the fireplace, say where you want to go, and since you're nervous, make a charisma saving throw, and the player rolls a nat 1. There's no arguing your way out of this. You got to come up with an option. So what does the DM do? He says, you said diagonally. You black out with a swirling sensation, and you wake up moments later in a strange shop. Through a window, you can see the spires of shops in Diagon Alley, but you've never seen this shop before. Did we mean for the character to end up here? Of course not. But sometimes the dice have a story of their own, and they're going to tell it. And we have to improvise. Before spending time prepping a location, you have an idea for it, you need to decide whether it's a primary, secondary, or tertiary location. If it's just a tertiary location, don't invest too much of your time. Just make a note of it, keep it available for use, so that next time you're playing, you can just bring it right out. Next time you're prepping your campaign or designing the next town your players visit, keep these categories in mind: primary, secondary, and tertiary locations. But now, let's shift gears a bit here, because I want to talk about the second thing I learned, and talk about redemption arcs. Every DM I know or have ever met or have ever listened to on YouTube loves a good twist, whether it's the friendly NPC who turns out to be the big bad evil guy, or the evil overlord who reveals a tragic backstory, humanizing them for the players, and perhaps creating a conflict of emotion when it comes to defeating the big bad guy. These are great storytelling tools, but overuse over decades has made them bland and frankly uninteresting. Sometimes the evil villain just needs to be evil. If you do want to include a redemption arc for your villain, though, I'd recommend using someone who isn't the big villain of the story. Let's look at 3 characters in Harry Potter and see exactly how this could be done. And it's going to, I think, clear a little bit up of what I mean. Draco Malfoy. He's a schoolyard bully. His upbringing, especially the influence of his father, forms him and molds him into a racist, routinely bullying children with Muggle parents or ancestors just because they're not purebloods. And he denounces anyone who associates with them as traitors. Draco's an easy target for our hatred as a reader, because naturally, we're rooting for Harry, the main character, and our conscience is stirred against his unjust bullying of Hermione, Ron, and Harry. Once Voldemort returns, we already know where Draco's allegiance lies. And sure enough, he quickly is inducted as a Death Eater. But then we quickly find out that things are not so simple in the Malfoy household. Voldemort, you see, suspects that Draco's parents might be traitors to him. And if not traitors, at least cowards, unwilling to stand up for the Dark Lord. So then, a burden of redeeming the family and preventing the murder of his parents falls on Draco. Draco has no choice but to join the Death Eaters, and he struggles emotionally to complete even simple tasks he is given, even using a transportation closet that might kill a songbird. Suddenly, Draco is more of a victim than a villain to us as readers. He's a slave to circumstances he didn't get to choose. Given all of this, wouldn't this redeem Draco? I don't think so, because he still chooses to go along with the plan. He has countless opportunities to change his ways, but in the end he chooses evil. This is a great example of giving a humanizing backstory, even making the villain into a pitiable character. But there is no attempt to actually redeem Draco, or make him out to be a good guy. Consider that alongside of Voldemort, rather Tom Riddle. Similar to Draco, we learn his backstory and might even be tempted to pity him. But this is the real villain of the story. There is no shade of gray in Tom Riddle. From the moment we dive into the Pensieve and see when Dumbledore first met Tom at the orphanage, we find him to be manipulative, cruel, cold, and already hungry for power. Whatever flames of pity we might feel are quickly doused by Tom's treatment of his fellow students at Hogwarts, the professors. He even frames Hagrid's pet spider, Aragog, for things he did. There's depth and humanity to the character of Tom, but there is no redemption to be had. There is no lasting pity for Tom, even as there is for Draco. Now, let's consider Severus Snape. Without a doubt, we all think he's a villain. Well, right up until about the 6th book, typically. Similar to Draco and Tom, Snape's backstory draws our pity. Unlike them, however, Snape is never the bully. It's he who is getting bullied. His turn towards becoming a Death Eater is not active, but reactive. It's when Lily Potter, his one true love, is killed protecting her son Harry. Snape's faithfulness to Voldemort snaps. With grief pushing his mind to the edge, Snape immediately begins to work as a double agent. This is why, despite all the hatred Snape has for Harry, Dumbledore trusts him completely. Snape is redeemed not by his actions, but by a broken heart. This is redemption, and it's completed when Snape sacrifices his own life to protect Harry, and therefore save the world. So why is Snape redeemed, but not Draco or Tom? Well, if you boil it down, you just have to examine their goals. Draco, although influenced by his father and the other Death Eaters, he has an evil goal. He wants to be powerful, as all good Slytherins do. And he is willing to harm innocent people for no other reason than making himself powerful. Likewise, Tom turns to dark magic only to make himself stronger. Snape, on the other hand, he joins Voldemort to protect Lily. See, Snape is concerned that Lily's life is in danger due to that infamous prophecy. And he feels that only by being on the inside of Voldemort's inner circle can he guarantee her protection and protect her life, even making an oath with Voldemort to do so. Once that fails, he no longer has any purpose for remaining a Death Eater, and he immediately rejoins Dumbledore's side. Draco and Tom's goals are inherently selfish, while Snape's are inherently unselfish. My advice would be to choose who in your story gets redeemed very carefully. Your best bet, don't redeem the big bad evil guy. Redeem one of his lieutenants, or redeem an NPC who's made some questionable choices in life. Don't rob your players of the satisfaction that comes from conquering someone truly evil. There's one final thing I want to talk about. I mentioned earlier that in Harry Potter, the characters don't go on a quest to find the villain. The villain keeps coming to them. Just think of all the times Harry faces Voldemort or some avatar of Voldemort. He does it at least once a year, starting from when he's 11. It's once per book at least. Of course, this is because Voldemort believes that the prophecy that Harry is the one who will defeat him, and thus he must kill Harry if he wants to complete his goal of world domination. But at our tables, wouldn't that be railroading? Wouldn't that override player agency by forcing them to face this conflict that they didn't choose? Your players might feel like they're being cornered, thrust into encounters that they had no way to avoid simply because you, the DM, said so. Obviously, we want to avoid doing that to our players, but I think this idea can still work. Harry is the chosen one through no choice of his own. In fact, the prophecy from Professor Trelawney, as we learn later in the books, is actually equally applicable to Neville Longbottom. I know the movies don't cover that, but it's a pretty big feature of the prophecy in the book. You see, Harry becomes the official chosen one, though, because Voldemort believed he was, and accidentally made Harry into an 8th Horcrux with the rebounding curse. That is what officially marked Harry as the only one who could fulfill the prophecy. These kinds of conflicts can work at our table if, and only if, we have honest discussions with our players and take an active role in helping them to build their backstories. We never want to write a backstory for our players. The choice is always theirs alone. What we can and should do is offer suggestions and accept if they don't want to take your suggestions. As backstories are developed, stay involved because your players might come up with something cooler, even cooler than you had planned yourself. It gives you the ability to craft a great story with specific ties to their backstory. Most adventures start with a quest hook that the players will follow. Not Harry Potter. Harry doesn't follow his quest hook the way we might expect our players to do at the table. When he finds out that his parents were killed by an evil wizard, he doesn't go hunting for his parents' killer. He goes to school. The conflicts of the story arise when Voldemort brings an attack against Harry. In many ways, Harry is the defensive hero, not an offensive one. Harry's a great example of allowing players to pursue their personal goals while still keeping the overall story moving forward. The trick to doing this is to tweak and craft the overall story session by session, being dynamic and willing to change based on those developing personal goals. Your purpose as a DM is to integrate the two, the overarching story and those personal goals. You can think of Harry getting his education, a personal goal, as being preparation for him to eventually face Voldemort, or as Snape says, raised like a lamb for slaughter. The villain tries to interfere from time to time, but Harry is still free to make his own choices, and he chooses to pursue his education. All this adds up to interesting stories with dynamic circumstances and compelling villains while never removing player autonomy. So now it's up to you. Try using these ideas in your next campaign or even try putting them into your next session. Let us know how it goes with a comment below. Thank you so much for watching this video, and as always, remember, there's room for everyone at the table.